Come in, Ocean Sailor. Come in, Ocean Sailor.
The Ocean Sailor Podcast. Brought to you by Ocean Sailor Magazine and Kraken Yachts.
Welcome to Ocean Sailor Podcast, Episode 8, with me, Dick Durham, and with he, Dick Beaumont. And we are going to listen to part 2 of Totem, the sailing yacht. The couple on board have their 3 children and have taught them as they've sailed around the world. So pretty remarkable stuff. And I think some possibly interesting questions, Dick, coming up this time.
So, hi everyone. We're already on podcast number 8. This is the second part, as Dick's already said, of the Totem podcast. In the first part, it was very, very interesting. You know, not many people have done what they've done with their children. A lot of people have taken off for a year or two, but this is a much more extended lifetime plan, really. And in part 2, we're going to try and ask them some of the poignant questions about how it all works out, how it worked out for the parents, how it worked out for the kids, and what their plans are for the future. So it's looking really good, and I think we should just get on with it.
I think that's a good idea.
I want to ask you a question. I think a lot of people would ask and consider, but I'd like to hear what you thought of thinking, well, have we done it right? Have we done it right by our kids? It's quite clear to see the fantastic advantage that they've got in the opportunity to see the world. But of course, you know, these things play in your mind. And I think many parents would be, let's say, very concerned about what we can say is depriving their kids of that standard education, you know, from perhaps 11, 12, 13-year-old. What do you think? What was your mindset about that?
Oh, my goodness. I am so convinced that it's been a great gift for our kids to skip some of those, especially early and middle teen years in mainstream culture, because it is so cruel. Kids can be awful to each other at that age, and they're kind of trying to figure out who they are a little bit. And this is when you see like cliques forming and us versus them stuff. And now that there's social media to help power and fuel some of that backstabby, gossipy stuff, what a nightmare. I'm so glad. And you know, what hammers that home for me, if I ever get that feeling of, are we really doing the right thing, is to check in with my peers, my parent peers, back in the States, back where we used to live, and the kinds of things that they're dealing with their kids, and think, wow, I'm so glad we don't have those issues. We've spared our kids a lot of angst, I think. By making this choice.
I think it's very easy to be able to identify increased risks that your children may have had as a result of sailing across the ocean. And what people, I think, forget is, and I think it's particularly poignant when you're talking about kids, is the trade-off. On one hand, there are risks, let's say, on an open sea on a small boat. At the same stage, of course, there are terrific risks that every parent spends their paranoid life worrying about, which is somebody stealing their children while they're, you know, not watching properly, or, you know, being caught up in car accidents. And in your own country, the US, of course, you know, the terrible gun crimes that are going on, and particularly visited on sometimes, you know, schools and young people. And then there's the drugs culture that you're able to take your children out of. So nonetheless, I'm kind of guessing that you must have had a fair bit of criticism one way or another from people who thought you were dreadful people doing this.
Of course,
lots. Is that right?
Oh, absolutely. It's very true, and I think a lot of it just stems from two things. One is a place of kind of the fear, right, of what they think we're facing and the dangers they think we're facing. And the fact that they accept the dangers in their lives because they can't do anything about them. They're used to the fact that, you know, that we've got gun violence, that there's that highways are so dangerous to be on. So there are all of these really huge risks that go in normal everyday life that they're just like,
exactly,
you know?
my point.
Meanwhile, like 3 weeks ago, 3 teenagers on the little island that were from in the States were killed because they were being stupid, drinking, and drove off a cliff. I mean, our kids are not in the situation that puts pressure on them to have ever landed in that place.
Before we left and we were preparing to go, there was a lot of judgment about what we were doing, and we expected it. There was some that was more harsh than we ever imagined could be possible, and it was things about we're ruining our children's educational future. They're not going to be normal because they're not socialized out in the ocean by themselves, and that we're putting them into situations of undue risk.
And here's what I really believe, that part of it is that they just can't appreciate, they don't have the knowledge about the real risk versus theirs. But the other is that they look at our plans and we're not judging them, but I think the reaction is that they feel that they are being judged because we're choosing to do something different and awesome. And they're kind of going to stay in the same little patterned life that they've got, and that's comfortable and that's fine, and no judgment there. That, we were really glad to break out of it, but I think that it makes them negatively react because
some
of that.
Some people actually get it, and they've got some wanderlust or some travel interest, and they think it's amazing. And other people live in their town their entire lives, and that's fine. Nothing wrong with that. But to overlay these judgments. We don't quite understand, because in the U.S. there are 35,000 people killed in car accidents per year, and there's gun violence and all the rest of it. And we have risks, but we also manage those risks by studying our craft, by knowing our boat's safe, by looking at weather and making smart choices.
I think a takeaway for podcast listeners that is important to me to share is that if they have this thought, they have this concept of a dream to go cruising, to take off, whether it's solo or with a partner or with a family, to be really cautious about who they share those plans with, and know that they're going to have that negative judgment. And as you test the waters of running that plan by people in their circle, those who really have the negative reaction, you know what? That's just kind of an area you don't go into with them anymore, because their negativity, even if they love you and it's well intended, if they're going to focus on asking negative questions based on their lack of understanding,
pirates,
storms, and they can't just celebrate the fact that because that they could trust you, that this is a good thing you're going to do, maybe shelve those conversations with them and just focus on, tennis matches next week or whatever. And with the friends who are like, I don't get it, but that's awesome. You go. I can't wait to visit you somewhere. Okay, they're the ones that you go to the pub with instead.
I think what Behan touched on earlier, which is fascinating, which was you were saying that really it's the people who are making. You're not judging them, and they're not really judging you either. What they're doing is they're judging themselves, kind of via you. They've projected their lack of get up and go, and they kind of wish they had this. They probably have got a dream. And they wish they had the kind of nerve to act it out, which is really fascinating.
Well, they may have gone to a lot of effort to set up a perfect life by living in the right place and sending their kids to the right schools. And you're suddenly, through your choice, implying that maybe that's not actually a really...
Right. Well, you have rejected that, haven't you? And you've said, actually, we understand that. We lived in that lifestyle. And, no, we're not going to. So... That's obviously a criticism implied, whether you say it or you don't. It's an implied criticism of how other people who are staying in that system live. But in particular, it seems to me, of course, you have quite a strong social media presence. And as I have fairly recently exposed myself to some, media, social media criticisms and stuff, and I must confess to being completely amazed by the kind of things that people come out with. It's clearly meant not really necessarily as a criticism of you. It's meant to demonstrate just how clever and how much more intelligent they are than you are, and generally they're wrong. And that's not because I think I'm smarter than them, but the fact that they're trying so hard to undermine what you're doing shows a lack in their own lives, I think. But when you're in the situation that you're in, with your head above the pulpit so far, I'm guessing you must have had a lot of people telling you, oh, just incredibly selfish. And, you're not even thinking of your children. This is all about you. You must have had that,
Very
surely.
much so. I remember the first time we experienced this in a big way. We had just arrived in this one part of Malaysia, and a columnist for the New York Times had tweeted, having heard about us, and said, I just learned about this family that's been sailing around the world for, at that time, 6 or 7 years or whatever
and
it
he's
was.
on the editorial board. He's very...
he's a Pulitzer Prize winning columnist, but he tweeted about it. A tweet, a little tiny couple of words strung together, and there were, I forget how many tens of thousands of comments.
Venom.
And people were just
The
horribly nasty.
venom.
Oh, they're
Worst.
selfish. They're ruining their kids. These
Worst
people
parents ever.
Oh, they're just on a death tour, and it's like
ruining their kids' lives.
And some of our friends then went on, and they were trying to defend us against
We're
it.
like, it's okay, thanks.
It doesn't matter. They will never get it, and that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
It's a relief to know that it's just as bad in America as it is in the UK. But I was staff on Yachting Monthly when the advent of online stuff happened, and we had a thing called Scuttlebutt on Yachting Monthly, and no one ever went on there to say what a great magazine we produced.
Right. Yes.
It was always attacking us, and the editor, he was beside himself. Paul Gelder then, he said, no longer with us. He said, I can't understand. I said, Paul, don't read it. If you don't, I said, I love reading. I think it's great. He said, well, why? I said, because it's fascinating to just see how warped they are.
It's
and
true.
of course, they're all hiding behind these monikers anyway, so nobody really knows who they are.
Yeah, I mean, Dick, I think I'm going to, let me just say, I think it's right that people are concerned and considering from their own viewpoints what's right and what's wrong. So I think whether somebody, and I'd like to say, reach out to the listeners that we've got listening to this and say, you may well have a different viewpoint, but hear both sides and understand both sides of the argument before you come to a determination. I'm just also going to say one other thing. Hasn't this last 12 months of this astonishing change to the world proven to us that actually not only should there be a different way, but there must be different ways? And I think, that's what I'm sure. I haven't asked you the question, but I'm taking it as read that your children are very, very aware about the effect of their carbon footprint on the world and living in a symbiotic way with the world and its full natural state. And that in itself is going to stand them in fantastic stead, isn't it, in the future? They'll have had an experience that other children might have had to read about, may agree with, but they will have seen it firsthand. That's powerful, I think.
Those firsthand experiences are incredibly powerful, and it's where a lot of real learning occurs. And a lot of both, what you refer to, their sensitivity to living with a light footprint, to our impact on the planet, but also so much their sensitivity to that we're one human race as opposed to a whole bunch of camps, and everyone has a future that they'd like to fulfill, and that we're, I guess, able to help them grow up as citizens of the world instead of citizens of some very privileged little camp in their home country.
With the bias and an agenda, it's so hard in the U.S. that environmentalism and concern for your footprint is a political issue that is marketed to and twisted and tormented these outcomes with people's beliefs that are crazy. And to then go and have the opportunities that we've had to see how people live and to be in island nations that are literally underwater and eroding away and sinking, and to be in a remote atoll in the middle of the Pacific and it's piled with plastic garbage. And to see the loss of fish life. You're in this pristine place and the coral is dead and there's no fish. These aren't theoretical scenarios. This stuff is real and it's now.
And when experiencing it instead of reading in a book really impresses it in a different way. But Dick, to go back to kind of where you started with this is what's happened in the last year with the coronavirus and how the pandemic has affected all of us. One of the things that the cruising life has really instilled in all of us is resilience. And we've seen how well that served our son when he migrated to go to college, that he was adaptable. This was a new country, a new culture, a new food.
It's what cruisers do.
We did that on a regular basis, and college was the next one. The hard part was that it was supposed to be his home.
That's very interesting, Behan. I don't think people will consider that they will perhaps see Niall as having a dreadful confrontation to move from the life that he's been living on the boat to suddenly organised life in a university or in a college. But what you're saying, I think what you're saying is, well, they've seen so much change that, hey, it's just there's different place, different people, but that's same.
Change is a constant.
Change is a constant.
Is that what you're meaning?
Yeah.
It is a constant. And as travelers, you face this on a daily basis, and you learn how to read a situation. You need to figure out where the grocery store is or where this place is and talk to people. And it's the same that he's experienced there, really. He's taken it that way, where some of his classmates, and I think it's not so uncommon for them to move out of their town to a new place, don't know anybody, and struggle with that experience. Where, from a cruising background, it's just a new anchorage.
And the other thing is, as I'm talking to you, it occurs to me that really change is almost the vehicle of assimilation, isn't it? Really, because you have to. You go to Papua New Guinea. There's a kid there with a sore on his foot. They don't share the same language, but you have to get on. You're breathing the same air. You're cooking over the same heat. You're assimilating. You're not one tribe v another, even though they all are there. So
that's right. You're sharing a moment where there is assimilation, where there's a more common understanding. Papua New Guinea is a great theme for today, I think, but a story from there that I'm reminded of is when we first got to Papua New Guinea, there was 3 generations of fishermen on this one otherwise uninhabited island that we were at, and they were taking a break from fishing, and here we are with this family, and it was a great introduction to Papua New Guinea. We're sitting around a fire one night on a beach in a spectacular place, and we learn that they're shark fishermen. And what they do is they go out and they catch the sharks and they cut the fins off, and a Chinese ship comes in once in a while and they sell it. And of course, we're enlightened Westerners, and we gave them a lecture on, well, can't you do more with the fish because it's so wasteful, and the finning and blah, blah.
You're farming to subsist, from your island, so surely people could eat that shark meat.
And they look at me and they say, "Are you stupid? Have you ever tried to wrestle an 18-foot pissed off shark into your boat, missing its limbs because you just cut them off?" And it's like, oh yeah, good point. And the practical.
And this is one of the only ways to get cash to be able to send your kids to school.
The understanding that came out of it for us is that the world's a complicated place. They're not the problem in shark finning. They're not doing this in a massive scale. They're pulling in a couple of sharks, and it's a means for them to get cash to put their kids to school. There are no other ways there to do that. This stuff is happening. It's real, and it's really complicated, especially when your total subsistence comes from what exists around this little tiny space that you live in.
Our son actually stopped eating seafood after seeing so much of these practices, and although in his case it was attributing it more to we were seeing commercial pillaging. The local level, you can understand that, but they're hungry now, right? And and how that happens.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
One thing that we do also would be good to we haven't touched on, but I'd be interested to hear what your safety rules on board were for your kids. How do you do it? How do you keep an eye on them? It's not easy, is it?
It's not, with the kids in particular. When they're small, it is especially challenging. And although my 2020 hindsight is that I think we could have left sooner, that was one of the reasons why we waited. We'd said we wanted to wait until our youngest was 5, but that was when we thought we were having 2 kids instead of 3. Anyway, we left when our youngest had just turned 4, and it is in those years where those little ones have lots of mobility to get around and don't have common sense and don't necessarily follow your direction. So you kind of need eyes in the back of your head, and it's a much bigger burden on parents because of juggling being on watch with kids and being on watch in the boat, and the fact that those 2 things can't really happen at the same time. But in terms of the rules that we have,
it is an area where it's easy to want to make judgments against other people, but your boat, your rules, and as long as you're doing things that if you feel you're safe, I guess that's good enough. I don't know. For us, it was that the kids, if we're underway, they needed to have a life jacket on.
If they were going to come up from down below deck.
Yeah, if anywhere in the cockpit or on deck, always a life jacket on.
Because none of them were swimmers when we left. Worst Parents of the Year award, moving on a boat with kids who can't swim, right?
And we lived in a place with cold water, so they never learned to swim. But they did quickly once we got to warm water. If we were not underway, the kids needed life jackets on if they were outside of the cockpit or if there was no other adults on the boat. And these were non-negotiable rules. Early on, when Niall was just a couple of years old, we were on a friend's boat, and he's like, these are my rules and about the life jacket. And Niall sort of pushed back and said, no, I'm going to take my life jacket off and walk around, and picked him up and sort of sat him down aggressively in the cockpit and said, the life jacket goes on or you go down below. Mm-hmm. And at the time, I remember thinking, oh, that's a little bit harsh. These were our mentors that had circumnavigated. And then realizing, this is a safety thing. And so effectively with us, it was ensuring that the kids always had this, but it was early on, it was making sure they also tried to have them understand why we're doing this. So it was important to help train them a little bit. So life jacket is so you can float, and now put it on and go in the water and see you're floating when you can't otherwise swim.
And that was the reason, I think you touched on it, but that was the reason that you decided to wait until Siobhan was 4. So, at 2 and 2.5, they're kind of bump and go mystery action, aren't they? No matter what you say to them, they get off in the opposite direction. And was that was so that you could reason with them a bit and explain?
That was the hope, yes, and it generally played out that way because those toddler years are. It's impossible, really.
But all little kids are different and individual, and we've seen some 2-year-olds that are absolutely insane, and I wouldn't want to be out on a boat with them because there's no reasoning, and there's no control. And other kids get it. Siobhan was, she was good in terms of following things. We could have left probably a year sooner, but there's some individuality there. And important part is that we stay on the boat when we're hoping to stay on the boat. For us. Normal day out sailing, if it's easy conditions, we don't wear life jackets. At night, we wear life jackets. If it gets rough, we wear life jackets.
And we clip in the cockpit. Oh. And clipping in, actually using a harness and tether was another great option for our kids if they wanted to be on deck or in the cockpit while we're underway. And it was in the tropics, and sometimes those life jackets can be pretty uncomfortable. Harness and tether was great. Leaving the cockpit was only then with an adult. As well.
I think safety is an interesting issue because it's easy to make judgments or perceive safety devices as great solutions because that's the product that's available. And if you dig in deeper, find that oftentimes there's some flaws to it, like tethers, for example. Oftentimes people lead their tethers down the side deck. Now, if you're on passage and you're walking down the side deck with your tether and you trip and fall, your chance of going overboard is still very high, and getting dragged along the side of the boat is probably not a great experience. So we've changed our tethers so that they're led almost centerline, as near to the middle of the boat as possible. So if you fall, you'll reach the extent of your tether and still be on the boat, which is a good feature.
Or at least not have your head in the water. Yeah.
I did a sailing test with, I'm going to name drop here, Sir Robin Knox Johnston, no less, some years ago. Yeah, to test out these tethers, and exactly that happened. We used a dummy that was weighed as what a real person would weigh, roughly, average person, threw it over the side and came to the conclusion, even no power, just sailing, and okay, we were doing about 4 knots. you drown in minutes.
Very quickly. And in a horrible way, because you're getting bashed up, and it's like a waterboarding event. So these things, how you set them up, there are subtleties to the details that make a huge difference in the outcome. There was I believe it was a French sailor in the mini transit, fell overboard, was getting dragged along the side of the boat, realized that it was not going to end well, cut his tether. And the boat ended up sailing on and then rounding up, and headquarters saw that the boat's track was weird. They sent another competitor out, and the guy was rescued. Unimaginably good outcome, but safety gear, how you do it, is very important.
And netting around the side of the boat, did you bother with that? Did you try that?
We did have it on our first boat prior to Totem, before we took off cruising, but did a lot of local cruising. And we really became quite convinced that it provides a false sense of security. We saw how quickly the UV, even in our higher latitude location, degraded that to make it effectively useless. What it was good for was keeping toys on board. I think fewer toys were lost, but we really wouldn't want to rely on it to keep a child or a person on board. So use it with a very heavy grain of salt.
We did on Totem, when the kids are younger, we had weather cloths that were on the lifeline down to the rail along the length of the cockpit, and I felt those added
solid sunbrella all the way
a bit
down,
of safety, right? Because it was solidly attached along the bottom. You couldn't slip under it, and the concern was if we're heeled over and bumbling along, and one of the kids or one of us loses footing, and we kind of roll out of the cockpit under conditions where we're not tethered in, daytime event, that would stop us. And since we're in our cockpit most of the time, that felt like it was a nice safety addition. Of course, UV ate that over time, and we've not replaced it. But all the kids are exceptional swimmers now, and
they are, and being in warmer waters is good. Although what I miss from that is the sun protection. It was good UV protection for us pasty white people that have to watch out for that.
Yeah, of course. When you were in Australia, the slip, slap, slop mantra is. It drove me crazy. I understand why, because they've got such a significant problem there with skin cancers and stuff. But if you're about out there with a child without a full suit on, like a latex, they're not probably latex, but whatever they are, you're almost a criminal, and all of those things, and of course kids do dehydrate much quicker than adults. They get sunburnt much quicker. So there's quite a lot to be thinking of. You've answered quite a lot of questions. My daughter knew I was doing this podcast with you today, and she has a 2.5-year-old son and also a 5-month-old daughter, and because of COVID they regularly out on the boat, but because of COVID they haven't been able to come out. But Britain is now trying to shrug off its the manacles that we've been living in and get back out. And I'm hoping to be able to get out to Turkey, and we were talking about coming out on the boat. And she said, what are we going to do now? Leo's 2.5, he's whizzing around all over the place. And you must ask the people you're doing this podcast to ask them to tell you exactly what to do. I said, well, they won't be able to do that, but they'll hopefully give us quite a few clues, and you have. So that's brilliant. Thank you.
Excellent.
Oh, glad to help. It's certainly a frustrating time. And I think the one thing we didn't mention that I think would be really important for her is to be able to have a way she knows she can secure her toddler for those occasions when she and her husband both have to be hands-on, because it happens. And you need to be able to do that, because you cannot take care of the boat and take care of a toddler who's willful at the same time.
Yeah, we got gaffer tape. Is that what you're thinking of?
Something like,
a Velcro
suit, kind of toss them on the bulkhead. We think, that's another good one.
So how do you mean? How do you mean a child seat with a harness that it can't get out of, like a car seat, really?
Actually, installing a car seat in the cockpit is a technique used by many sailing parents.
when they're very young, that's a good one.
Idea.
And when they're a little bit older, the video babysitter can be awesome, because when you have to dock the boat and you really need both people focusing on that, you can't pause and say, okay, Junior, stop, bickering. I don't care if you're hungry. We have to do this thing now.
We had a place we called, and I'm not proud, we called it baby jail. And for when they were very small, but starting to get mobile and rolling around and things. And it was essentially a cutout. This is in our old Hallberg Rossi 352. And it was a cutout on the settee in the starboard side to be able to make it like another berth. But it was a perfect place. You could actually kind of stuff a small child in there and have a pillow to prevent them from rolling out. So they're in there and they might not be happy about it, but we could both go and dock and know the kid would be there when we were finished.
Yeah, I mean, it's right, isn't it? Of course, children do always, demand attention, and certainly are very vocal about it when they want attention. But of course, when you're coming in to moor the boat in a marina or something else has occurred, unfortunately, you've got to concentrate on the boat, and that's going to provide the best safety for the child as well, because you're looking after the boat. And it is a worry. I sailed with my son when he was one. Practically one of us, which was my wife generally, was always incapacitated, needing to sit and hold our son until he became of an age where you could, explain to him exactly what he needed to do so that he could ignore that instruction properly.
They also have their uses. I remember my oldest daughter now, who's got two children herself, but when she was a tiny girl of about 2 or 3, I suppose, I had a very old boat, and I dropped an adjustable spanner down through the lazarette into the bilge, and I tried every way to get at it, and I couldn't. And I said, Katie, I'm just going to lower you down into this hole on this rope.
I
you
love
can just
it.
put your hand.
Yes.
And she got it back for me.
Right.
I've never told her mother.
They can sometimes reach into little spaces. Well, perhaps now she'll know. And along that theme, actually, we discovered, this is our first year out, and we're cruising in coastal Mexico, and often fishermen here will use buoys on their fishing nets, which are very difficult to see. They'll repurpose like a 2-liter soda pop bottle, and unless, even if that's got a colored tint to it, it's very hard to see bobbing on the ocean when there's any kind of sea state. Our 4-year-old could see them. And she pointed one out to us while we were in the cockpit sailing along, just as we were approaching, and may have run into some problems getting tangled up in it. And so, boy, she lived up there in the cockpit with us to help with net spotting, with buoy spotting for the rest of that afternoon.
It was honestly a great early lesson for us that kids can be valuable resources on the boat, because their sound, their hearing is better, their eyesight is better. And these are good resources as a sailor to help make decisions.
Sure.
They have in other situations saved us from some calamities, really, because of that, and not just being able to spot the buoys, but hearing there's a sound that's not quite right. And it turned out, the pump is running, the freshwater pressure pump is running, and there's been a leak, and we were going to drain our tank.
As you're telling us that, it's occurred to me to ask you a question. At what age did your children, and did they all at various times, do a watch alone?
So, almost never.
I mean, obviously Niall's now an adult and has been for quite some time. And Merrin is also, she's 19, isn't she?
Mm-hmm. She is.
So and Siobhan is now 17. I imagine they must be very competent yachts people, and you must, do you or don't you?
So they are quite competent now, but we've been fairly adamant as children that they would not stand watch alone. And there is a point, and this is where every kid is different, and you will know as a parent when it may be appropriate for your kid, for them to participate in watches. They could partner with us on watches from the very youngest age, honestly. But to be solo is a huge responsibility, and my concern with this comes from the fact that we have seen teenagers whose brains are just not yet fully formed, who may have good intentions to stand watch, miss something, and a boat was lost. Another boat was wrecked, and a parent lost their leg while teenagers were on watch. Teenagers who had all the right training and intentions and boat experience. Yeah, that's a huge weight and burden to have.
There's
not at all.
Well, so they would stand watch during the daytime when one of us was maybe up there and then down cooking a meal, but back and forth. But they were on watch for that period of time as teenagers. Now, at some point, Niall was fully on watch himself, and then he's done night watches as well. But not until he was probably around 17, 18 were we doing that.
Yes.
Because before then, and other people have different approaches in this, and that's fine. But we know of these stories of teenagers on watch making poor choices, drifting their attention, and the boat ends up in a tragic situation. And these kids then have to live with that for the rest of their lives. And it's not to say that kids can't be relied on and trusted, because we get into an anchorage and we're going to go in to buy groceries or check in with the port captain, and we would tell the kids, okay, you're effectively on watch even though we're anchored, and you got to pay attention. If a squall comes, you know what to do. And they'd be like, yeah, we know, hold station if we started to drag, and blah, blah, blah. And so we trust them with responsibility, but over a 4-hour period in the middle of the night when you're going around an island or squalls can come and ruin the day, we feel like...
We're reluctant for those reasons.
Yeah.
I knew, I won't say he was a friend, but I knew a guy, and he was sailing, him and his wife and 2 kids, and he told me most proudly that his son did a full night watch at the age of 13, and I'll be honest, I was bloody horrified. I just thought that was absolutely mental. But obviously, and everybody matures at a different rate. All adults, all children become more mature or less mature at certain times, and that's why I asked the question. 17, 18. I could understand that, and that's would be my thinking. But then that's how it worked for you, eh?
And that's right. And every child is different. So when they've got that maturity and the sense of responsibility, then increasing amount of time and standing watch is fine. The flip side for us is that when the kids were really very young, we also had safety talks with them, because
like a crew briefing.
Yeah, ignoring that there could be safety situations where they need to take an action just because they're 4 or 5 years old is I think the wrong approach. And so
they're very much treated as members of the crew. They're not kind of mollycoddled in the sense.
And early on we would say, okay, you have to practice now. You have to put this harness on and take it off, and put it on, take it off, so that you could do this.
Now do it with
in
your eyes
the dark
shut.
really quickly if you had to. And we would practice.
We would do scavenger hunts to find all of the locations of the fire extinguishers on board, or whatever. Right?
How quickly can we get to the
that's
fire
good
extinguishers and turn it over to make sure you hear that the powder's not packed down? It's still good. And practicing where the handholds on the boat. So if you're on deck and we had to do something, you can handhold your way across in the dark.
Blindfold. Parent not blindfolded watching, but now let's go from the cockpit to the bow and back again and feel your way there. Get to know the physical landscape of that boat in case you had to do it under a difficult circumstance.
But with kids, you have to do it as a fun thing. It can't be a scary scenario. Okay, if we're sinking, you got to do this or whatever.
But these are easy to gamify, right?
I'd like to ask a couple of mundane questions. Perhaps they're mundane, but I can reckon that so many people that will be listening to this will be wanting to know the answer. I've heard and been told lots of ludicrous stories about the cost of going off cruising. The common one is that it costs you 10% of the boat's value to maintain the boat, let alone live in. And that's complete rubbish. And can you put a figure on what you need to earn to subsist as a family and not be on the breadline?
So I think that that's such a hard question to answer, and it is kind of what everyone wants to know. Like, what do you need to live on every year? And I think it is impossible to put a rule of thumb figure on that, because we just see people living at such wildly different budgets, and I think you kind of spend what you have. You could try to come up with a minimum, but then someone who could never live to that minimum takes that as gospel, thinks that's enough, and goes out and completely completely fails. It's
no. I meant for you, really, for you
us?
guys.
That's easy. So we've got data on that, and it's something that we use in our coaching practice with people, not because our numbers are going to be their numbers, but because we use it to give them a framework to try to estimate what their budget would look like based on their habits and their boat and their geography and things like that.
We spend for long-term average about $35,000 a year as a family of five.
Frightening consistency, that 35,000 for us over time.
Little.
When it's broken has been in the last 2 years. 2 years ago, where we spent like an additional probably, I think, 30K. Actually, it's even more. I still have to put some numbers in that because we were replacing rigging, replacing hatches. We did a ton of work on Totem.
Yeah, after 13 years of cruising, you kind of wear bits of the boat out. And so I totally agree that the 10% rule is a dumb rule. It doesn't make sense for maintenance. However, there's this sort of cyclical picture, really, that is...
where you really spike in some years and spend so much more.
It's 7. I think it's 7 years. Did you say 7 years?
So that was our first big haul out.
Lucky 7, when all the money leaves your pocket.
Yeah.
And now...
And then last year for COVID, we spent only about $26,000 US, as opposed to literally every year since we started tracking before that, we're 35,000 plus or minus a few $100s. Like, we don't try. It's just kind of apparently what we live to.
Yeah, you wouldn't get so far on that in Australia, mind you.
Yeah, no, not so far. No,
that was about
no
6 weeks or something.
Yeah, and this year will be a bigger year for us because we're just starting into a repowering. Our engine is end of life at this point, which is unfortunate. We're going to do a hull paint job. We've got some cabin work we're going to do, so it'll be a bigger year for us.
Our stove is dying. The stove we put in 2008 needs enough bits replaced and has enough corrosion that it's time to swap it out.
Chain is worn out.
I must remember to send you the full specification of a Kraken fish.
Yes, you must.
Please do. We'll wipe a little tear as we look at our bank account, but actually that'd be cool.
Friends and family discount.
Yeah, I'm sure we can work something out. Yeah.
Was there anything that you gave up in order to do this? Did you stop drinking, stop smoking, or have you kind of denied yourself anything?
The one thing that we've denied ourselves was extra travel from the boat. We've done this only on a few occasions.
Yes,
but inland travel to go
flying.
See a tourist destination. In some places we did not do that, or we never traveled home, because flying 5 people to the U.S. from Southeast Asia is a lot of money. But that said, we did also save money for places where you can't miss the local local tourist experiences.
Right, you can't go to South Africa and not go into the game parks
or Sri
and
Lanka.
see the animals.
Right,
yeah, you can't go to Sri Lanka and to miss some of the incredible history, like Sigiriya and some of the old some of the relics that are there to see, which are you just walk up and walk around and touch. It's incredible.
So the Temple of the Tooth in Kandy and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, the Temple of the Tooth, to experiences upon experiences that we often didn't do, but selectively did. And before departure, the things that we stopped doing, I guess, to try to save, or the things that changed, I guess, between our life before and our life as cruisers, also is eating out in restaurants. We almost exclusively prepare all of our meals on the boat. The exception would be when we're in a place that's actually very inexpensive to eat on shore. Oh. Mexico is a great example of that. In Thailand, I'm pretty sure we could eat more cheaply on shore. Indonesia was brilliant for that. But
when you make it up the Thames, okay, and you come to London, I will take you out for dinner myself.
Oh, thank you, Dick.
Look forward to it.
Goals.
One of the things, just let's come back into one thing. Just tell us a little bit about your book and your target audience and the people that are contacting you, and the service that you give them. Who is it and how do they get hold of you to get the kind of advice that you can give them?
Mm-hmm. Well, the book is kind of where we got started in some ways, around the time we were hauled out in Thailand doing one of those bigger refits, the 7-year cycle. I worked on co-authoring a book with 2 other cruising parents called Voyaging with Kids. And we did that because as Jamie and I were preparing to go cruising, there were plenty of resources for us to look at preparing how to go cruise, but there were none which applied the parent filter. And we really feel that the more people that can get out and go cruising, kind of the better for everyone. Bigger world views for the folks that go, and just an incredible opportunity for families to be strengthened and improved by the experience. So this book is intended to not be a standalone cruising guide, how to go cruising guide per se, but to fill in all those blanks with the questions that parents would have, from getting started to dealing with the resistance that the grandparents and relatives may have, to their own questions. Our last chapter is a collection of essays by former cruising kids talking about how that affected them as adults to have this experience of cruising as a kid.
Interesting.
And we wanted also to have a diverse point of view. There have been a handful of other books by cruising families in the past, but they tended to only reflect that boat, that family's experience, and not a broader experience. So we brought in probably, more than 70 different families, whether it was through interviews, surveys, sidebars, to try to reflect the breadth of what's out here to help people think about what their path into cruising might be like. So that's Voyaging with Kids, and it earns us kind of nothing. I mean, there's the royalties, like our coffee budget. That's okay. It's not why I put the time into that. It really is to help more people get out there, which is kind of what our cruising service evolved from, in a sense, because as more and more people started coming to us with questions about, how do you do this? How can I do this, with my partner, with my family? We started spending a lot of time answering questions that came in off the internet as our writing got more popular, and putting a ton of time in, and sometimes never hearing back. We were sort of like, well, maybe there's a better way to do this. And it was in 2016, when we were back in the US for the first time in about 9 years, that we sat down and organized what a framework for a coaching service would look like. We've now helped, 260 some?
68, I think.
Wow. Okay. So
families,
mostly families, to go cruising. And that's a really powerful feeling. It began as a way to help folks get ready to go cruising. It has evolved into, we're actually supporting a lot of people in the early stages of their cruising as they're getting their feet under them and getting comfortable with everything from international clearance to real world weather. Jamie does a lot of weather routing support, to bigger picture routing and where can we go this season? The things that we can talk about before they go, but which are suddenly very real when you're living them at sea level.
And a lot in between. There's a lot of pitfalls when you're first on your boat about, with a family, spending too much time trying to make the boat perfect and have all the right gear and everything, and completely ignoring your kids in the process. Your kids are in this new place in an unfamiliar boat and setting, and they're like, this is no fun. I don't want to do this anymore. And so we talk about the happiness engineer, making sure that you build in fun to every single day, because it's important that they enjoy this, or else it's going to be a short cruising career. It's helping people avoid those pitfalls.
And then the other work that we do to support ourselves out here now, which actually I still kind of can't believe it, that we're able to continue this lifestyle by helping other people get out there and enjoy it too, because we think it's pretty awesome, is that Jamie went back to his roots as a sailmaker. When I met him, that's what he'd been doing for a number of years at a very elite level, and he got a little burned out, took a break from sailmaking when we moved to the U.S. West Coast, got back into it as a cruiser.
And it took a while to dust off the old sailmaking cap, but you spend enough time on passage staring at sails, and it's like, okay, yes, I remember all this, and get into sailcloth more and details, and then it was going further and learning what makes good cruising sails, and so it's been fun to pick that up again and help other sailors get some good product, better use out of their sails and their boats.
And there have been times, Jamie, I think you've mentioned to us before that there have been people you've had to dissuade from doing this. Perhaps you can
that's right.
enlighten us on that a bit.
With the advent of YouTube and more social media that has reached out and kind of pulled people in that didn't have a sailing background, it's great for the marine industry.
Well, and it's awesome that people are considering alternative ways of life, that social media has helped normalize a lot of this and make it look accessible. That's a win.
Right. So with coaching, some people come to us with no experience, and you can tell they'll do fine. They've got mechanical aptitude, they've traveled, all these combination of things. You can tell they'll work it out. We just need to develop those sailing skills. and make it make sense. And then there's other people that reach us with ideas that just aren't really aligned. They watch, too many YouTube channels and not rooted in reality. It's more the glamour shots on the beach with the umbrella drinks and things like that.
And they're not keen to get really hands-on with, in the engine or whatever it is. Or they're maybe very misaligned in terms of expectations on cost. There is an unfortunate, I think, perception that cruising can be incredibly inexpensive. And while it can be done very frugally, especially compared to life on land, it does still take money.
Yeah, I mean, I massively agree with that. I've met a lot of people that are doing, sailing around the world on an extremely low budget. And I would also say, unfortunately, one of the reputations that world cruising yachties have is that they give out the perception that the rest of the world has got to pay for them to be cruising around, and everybody's got to do everything for them for nothing. Whereas, of course, everybody's really just trying to earn a living as well. I bet you've had a fair bit of that as a sail maker. As soon as there's been a decent crossing just, under your belt and there's a group of yachties, I would think that there's plenty of people rowing over and asking you, look, is that or an electrician? If you were an electrician as well, I think you'd have no time to go sailing. You'd all be staying in the anchorage, fixing everybody's boat for them.
Oh, it's true.
Well, sort of. I mean, working while you cruise is actually a really complicated topic because we don't have legal authority to work in countries overwhelmingly, right? I mean, to go through the process of legally working in Australia was actually a really significant process. My employer had to do a bunch of paperwork, hire a lawyer, pay fees. I had to fit in a very narrow definition of what was an okay person to hire. So we're super cautious about that. And where our work is all virtual, it's done through the internet with people around. Jamie doesn't do repairs or make sales on our boat. Everything is done elsewhere, and he's consulting remotely. So in a way, that's what the YouTube generation is doing too. They're creating a product to sell, and we're creating products to sell. And I think that's kind of the opportunity for a lot of folks to figure out what's their thing that they can do that allows them to maintain a legal presence. And because I think legacy cruisers give the impression that you could just show up and work for yachties or work in harbors and ports, and it's just not like that.
No, I very much agree. You'll run into a hell of a lot of trouble if you try.
That's right, you can in some places, but there's still, to your point, there's no shortage of people after a passage that'll come over and say, "I hear you're a sailmaker, and I hear you're a rigger."
At this thing?
I'll come over and lend a hand. But those aren't really money making opportunities.
Yeah, that's just like cruiser karma stuff, right? I mean, we all help each other out here all the time.
I think perhaps we might be reaching a conclusion. We've been talking to you for 2 hours. It's a long time. So I would like to just ask you finally, if I may, the plans next for you. I think you're talking about Northern Pacific, if COVID allowing, is that it?
COVID allowing, yes. We're really looking forward to striking out from North American continent and heading back to the Pacific. The path for that probably looks like South Pacific first and then maybe North Pacific for cyclone season, just to flip hemispheres. But it really will be driven by COVID and how things have progressed. And although some portions of the Pacific have been reopening, there's still very much a question mark in our minds. Particularly for the smaller, vulnerable islands where vaccine rollout is relatively slow. I think they're being especially cautious. Kiribati locked down in January last year. I mean, they were among the first, and there is no one going in there. Tuvalu, Marshall Islands.
Interesting, Fiji's open.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So Fiji's a really great model. And what they've done in creating what they call the blue lane is brilliant. I actually don't think it's a good assumption that 7 or 8 days of time at sea is a way of saying you won't have COVID. You can still very much pass it among a crew, be asymptomatic, and show up with an active case on board. But Fiji has still created processes for testing at each end and quarantine on arrival. And there's a whole lot of cost associated with that, of course. For our crew, for example, it would cost more to enter Fiji today, arriving from, say, French Polynesia, our likely probable prior port, than it would for us to go to the Galapagos, which is sort of famously expensive for all of its permits and fees. So,
wow.
a chunk more to enter Fiji. So yes, possible, managed brilliantly. I wish more Pacific nations would follow the lead of Fiji, even for the inconveniences and costs to allow, because they call it a blue lane, but it's not. It's like it's a blue stop. There's nowhere to go from there at this point, unless you're able to write the check to quarantine yourself in a government run facility in Australia, or want to roll the dice and go into Southeast Asia, which is a very big roll of the dice and a really long distance.
One positive note for all the horror that COVID has caused, and I think it's caused a lot of people to reevaluate. We touched on this earlier, just the meaning of their life. And there are so many people now that actively want to go cruising or to travel. The marine industry has been booming. The people that we work with, people are coming from all over the place. We're working like 15 hours a day helping get people onto a boat and to go cruising, even if it's restricted because of COVID, but they're getting out some to experience life.
For example, a family in Australia who was able to, you have to get permission to leave Australia, right? But they wrote their application to get permission. We helped them with the remote purchase of a boat in the U.S., getting that boat ready to go. And they're now they cruised through the Bahamas and they're in the Dominican Republic, having a blast, mind you.
Absolute.
Yeah, there are complications for traveling in the Caribbean under COVID as well, and you've got to know what to do before you show up somewhere. But it's still doable. And
it's just another complication, is it? I mean, you'll know. I was very, very surprised, but that's what you get nowadays. I mean, you're still able to travel the world,
just pre-arrival
but you
homework.
do have to be aware of what the legislation and the various customs and immigration rules are. But yeah, I mean, and COVID's just added another layer on top of it that we've got to think about. But it is still all doable. It's, you've got to obviously change your venues and change your timing to some extent. But it is still doable, and there's still, now people are getting itchy to get back out and go sailing again, aren't they? But there you go. Anyway, look, I guess as Dick said 4 or 5 conversations ago, we've covered a monster amount of ground and a lot of common interests. It's been very, very good talking to you. And thanks very much for your time and your insights.
Truly our pleasure. Thank you very much for having us. We love being able to share stories. It's really fun to see the common stories, the common ground that we've got, and hopefully inspire a few more people to think about going cruising.
Thanks very much to Behan and Jamie. That was an incredibly interesting discussion. We very much appreciated they've opened their hearts to us and told us the story, warts and all. And Behan and Jamie have also invited any of the listeners that are, considering any of the issues with their children and sailing off, to be in touch with them via their website, and they'll be very happy to exchange information. So that's fantastic stuff. And Dickie, what's next in Ocean Sailor then?
Well, what's in the next Ocean Sailor? I think a lot of good material. We've done quite an in-depth look at tenders, types of tenders, and how you should take them with you, tow them or have them in davits. That's one quite big long feature. We've also been speaking to Graham Wilding, and he's got a really interesting insight into Fiji, especially during COVID. But the big story really is, of course, the launch of the new K50, Dick. I think you can tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, I certainly can. Just before we come off of the point with Graham Wilding, Ding, as I know him to be, it was in Fiji that I first met Ding. We anchored in the same bay, and I swam across, and he offered me to climb aboard and proffered a beer, which I wasn't able to resist. He's a good guy, and he's done some very interesting stuff. The big story, as you say, Dick, is the launch of Sophie Marie, Kraken 50 version 2, 003 is the hull model. It's gone astonishingly well. I mean, you always worry about these things. She hit the waterline dead right. the boat is absolutely superb, and we're carrying a big article this month in Ocean Sailor about the launch, and there's video that people can see as well on the various social media outlets. So I do hope that people will have a look at it. We're extremely proud of what we've done. But also, Dickie, haven't you, didn't you, or were you going to do something about Gypsy Moth? Because I know you sailed on her.
Yes, indeed, I did, and I have. I've described Gypsy Moth 4 as the world's most famous yacht. I mean, that's arguably so, as she certainly was at one time, because she was the first small craft to sail with only one stop, single-handed around the world. At the helm, of course, was Francis Chichester. Then she was incarcerated at Greenwich alongside the Cutty Sark for about 30-odd years.
Yeah, Dickie, I saw. How long ago was that she was there?
It's 1966, 67 that Chichester made his circumnavigation.
Yeah, was it really? Yeah, because I did go and see her when she was up at Greenwich.
Yes.
And it looked strangely small next to the Cutty Sark and very vulnerable, but a beautiful boat even then.
Well, you're right. I mean, she looks small against the Cutty Sark, but I think she looks small anyway. I mean, the kind of position I took on considering the boat was she a real classic or was she a crank? Because she was a difficult boat to sail. She was finished in a rush because Chichester was eager to get going. In fact, before Sir Alec Rose set off to make his circumnavigation, Chichester wanted to be the first, and that's the story behind the story, if you like. So Gypsy Moth 4 was built in a rush. She didn't have enough beam.
Dick, I don't think people know that, do they? I
they
certainly
will
wasn't
do.
aware of it. Yeah, it's interesting.
Well, they will do. Well, I mean,
Alec Rose was in Lively Lady, wasn't he?
He was indeed.
Yeah.
Yes, he was. The sailing grocer from Southsea, and everybody. He was, because Chichester being the first got the limelight, but it would have been, in fact, Sir Alec Rose, because he set off before Chichester, but he had a gear failure and had to put into somewhere on the south coast. Knowing this, Chichester then raced ahead and put pressure on the team to get his boat finished, and he set off, and of course he then did become the first. But I mean,
interesting.
Yeah, it is. He and then of course, Yachting Monthly had a campaign to get the boat restored, rebuilt, and taken around the world again. This time, obviously, not going via the 5 capes, Cape Horn, and the Cape of Storms that you went round. Off South Africa and the others, but instead, of course, the more easygoing cruising route. And so she was rebuilt, she was taken around the world again, and this was to celebrate both the centenary of Yachting Monthly and also 40 years to the day that Chichester came back to Plymouth. And so we did do that, and I was on a couple of the legs. So I thought it was time to have a look back on this to discover or to ask the questions, was Gypsy Moth really fit for purpose? And you can find out the answer in Ocean Sailor.
Well, I guess she made it, so she must have been, eh?
Yes, indeed, she did. And so that the answer is probably yes, but there's quite a lot of things that happened en route which might have made you want a slightly different boat.
Yeah, yeah, fair enough. Well, that'll make interesting reading. The other thing that I'm going to do in this month, I'm just about to write it now, is one of my. It's become a bit of a cliche now. I've been asked many times, what do I like best, diving, sailing, or fishing? And my answer is that my perfect day is fishing while I'm sailing to a dive spot. And so fishing is a very big part of what we do on White Dragon and what I did on Moonshadow, because we're pretty self-sustaining. Almost anywhere in the world, perhaps except the Mediterranean, where you could starve to death if you're waiting to catch a fish while you're sailing there. So I'm going to do an article about sailing while you're fishing and the various techniques and some of the things I've learnt over the years.
Well, that will be interesting. I've got a question there for you, Dick, because I was told a long time ago, don't know how true this is, but that many of the fish in the Mediterranean are known as thermometer fish because they're full of mercury. I don't know how true that is.
Well, I think it's unlikely that anybody will ever find out, because I can tell you, I having sailed right the way across the Med from Gibraltar right the way to Turkey, I had one take the whole way.
Really?
One take. Yeah, and that was almost in Turkey. Turkey, there's still a few fish left. But, yeah, I mean, well, I think that's a bit of... I think it's a little bit of a myth. But undoubtedly, the more that's being discovered about the state of our seas, unfortunately, the more it's being exposed of how much we've abused the seas. So, yeah, there probably is some truth to it. Of course, the big thing as well at the moment is microplastics and them being consumed in fish. So, it's but nonetheless, plastic or no plastic, mercury or no mercury, I think a good fresh tuna can do you an awful lot of good, especially sashimi.
Fair enough. Good. Well, I'll drink to that.
So, I dare say, Dick, we've got an interesting little segue that you're going to sign off on.
A little payoff line coming your way.
Oh,
well, why not? Well, I thought because we had the subject with Behan and Jamie and sailing schools and all the rest of it, I thought I'd considered the alphabet again, and it reminded me of the Bargeman's Alphabet, which is an old song from my part of the world on the east coast of England, and it goes like this. A is for the anchor, which goes up and down. B is for the bowsprit, which goes in and out. C is for the capstan, which goes round and round. And D is for the dog that barks on our stern. Is that enough? There is a chorus.
No, it's enough. Can't we just say goodnight? Let's just say goodnight.
Night,
Thanks, everyone.